Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
What if the moment a man stops chasing, stops forcing, and stops trying to control everything is the exact moment he finally begins to awaken? Most people think masculine power is about action, dominance, and relentless pursuit. But what if the deepest transformation begins not in control, but in surrender? What if the very thing he fears letting go is the doorway to his highest self? Because the shocking truth is this: masculine awakening rarely begins with victory. It begins with collapse, with silence, with heartbreak, with the painful realization that the old version of him can no longer survive. And the question is, when life strips away his illusions, will he break, or will he finally become who he was meant to be? Chapter 1. The misunderstood meaning of surrender. There is a word that makes many men uncomfortable before they even understand it. Surrender. The moment they hear it, something inside tightens. Their jaw hardens. Their mind resists. Because to the untrained masculine ego, surrender sounds like defeat. It sounds like weakness. It sounds like losing ground, lowering the sword, walking away from the battlefield with empty hands. And that is exactly why so many men never discover its true power. Because surrender, in its deepest form, has nothing to do with giving up. It has nothing to do with becoming passive, soft in the broken sense, or disconnected from purpose. True surrender is not the death of masculine power. It is the death of masculine illusion. That is the shocking truth. Most men are taught to believe that power comes from force, from staying in control, from pushing harder when life resists, from fixing what is broken as quickly as possible, from never bending, never pausing, never admitting that something deeper is happening beneath the surface. They are taught to confuse tension with strength. So from a young age, many men build their identity around resistance. Resist pain. Resist uncertainty. Resist vulnerability. Resist stillness. Resist anything that threatens the image they have created of who they think they must be. The provider. The protector. The achiever. The man who always knows. The man who never falls apart. The man who keeps moving, even when his soul is begging him to stop. But what happens when life no longer responds to force? What happens when the relationship cannot be controlled? When the goal no longer satisfies? When the success feels empty? When the prayers seem to echo back in silence? When the old methods, the old masks, the old identities stop working? That is where the real journey begins. Because surrender begins at the edge of exhausted control. It begins when a man realizes that the more he grips, the more he loses. The more he chases, the more he fragments. The more he performs strength, the weaker he becomes inside. And slowly, painfully, he is brought to a place he never wanted to go. A place where effort alone cannot save him. This is the moment many men misread. They think they are failing. But in truth, they are being invited. Invited into a deeper form of masculinity. Invited into reality. Invited into the sacred dismantling of the false self. Surrender is not saying, I no longer care. It is saying, I can no longer lie. I can no longer pretend this version of me is whole when it is built on fear. I can no longer call it strength to suppress what is real. I can no longer worship control when it is destroying my peace. I can no longer chase a life that looks powerful from the outside, but feels dead on the inside. That is surrender. It is a holy honesty. And honesty is where awakening starts. Because a man does not awaken the moment he gains more power over the world. He awakens the moment he stops running from himself. Read that again, not with the mind, but with the soul. A man does not awaken when he learns how to dominate every outcome. He awakens when he can finally sit in the fire of truth without escaping. That fire is not comfortable. It burns away fantasy. It burns away egoic certainty. It burns away the addiction to being seen a certain way. It burns away the desperate need to prove worth through conquest, productivity, or emotional distance. And what remains after the burning is something far more real than the image he once protected. Presence. Presence is the first gift of surrender. Not performance. Not aggression. Not constant motion. Presence. A grounded man is not powerful because he controls every room he enters. He is powerful because he is no longer at war with his own inner world. He no longer needs noise to avoid silence. He no longer needs endless validation to feel real. He no longer needs to force outcomes in order to feel safe. He can stand still without collapsing. He can feel deeply without losing direction. He can face uncertainty without abandoning himself. That is not weakness. That is mastery. But the world rarely teaches men this. The world often rewards the image before the essence. It celebrates visible dominance, but ignores invisible discipline. It praises the man who appears unshaken, but rarely understands the man who has actually made peace with his storms. And so many men spend years, sometimes decades, becoming impressive but not integrated. They build bodies, businesses, reputations, achievements. And yet beneath it all, there is a quiet unrest they cannot explain. Because no outer structure can heal an inner split. If a man is disconnected from his truth, then even his victories will feel haunted. Even his success will feel fragile. Even love will feel threatening. Because anything real has the power to expose what has not yet been healed. This is why surrender is so often the doorway to masculine awakening. Not because surrender makes a man smaller, but because it stops him from living inside what is false. Imagine a man gripping a rope in a storm. His hands are bleeding, his muscles are trembling, and the very thing he is holding is pulling him toward destruction. But he keeps gripping because he has been taught that letting go means losing. He keeps calling it strength, even as it tears him apart. Now imagine the moment he realizes the rope was never saving him. That moment is terrifying, but it is also liberating. Because when he releases what is killing him, his hands are finally free to receive what is true. This is how awakening begins. Not with a perfect plan. Not with a loud revelation. Not always with light. Sometimes it begins in ruin. Sometimes it begins in confusion. Sometimes it begins with tears a man never thought he would allow himself to cry. Sometimes it begins in silence so deep that he can hear every false thing inside him breaking. And still that is grace. Because grace does not always arrive as comfort. Sometimes it arrives as collapse. Sometimes it arrives as the ending of what you were never meant to keep carrying. Sometimes it arrives by removing every illusion that once made you feel secure. And for the masculine soul, this can feel unbearable at first. Because if he has built his identity around being the one who holds it all together, then surrender will feel like death. In a way, it is. But not the death of the true man. It is the death of the costume. The death of the mask that said he had to be invulnerable to be worthy. The death of the armor that kept love out. The death of the endless striving that disconnected him from the present. The death of the old inner religion that taught him control was the same thing as power. The false self dies hard. It does not step aside politely. It bargains. It panics. It tries to regain control. It whispers, push harder. Prove more. Don't stop now. Don't feel this. Don't let anyone see you here. But awakening asks for something else. It asks for courage deeper than performance. It asks a man to remain present while the old identity trembles. To stop numbing. To stop pretending. To stop reaching for external solutions to internal fragmentation. And that is why surrender is not passive. It is one of the most courageous acts a man can make. It takes no great consciousness to keep repeating what is familiar. It takes no deep strength to keep hiding behind noise. It takes no spiritual maturity to keep calling control leadership when it is really fear wearing a crown. But to surrender, to be still enough to hear the truth, to release what no longer aligns, to admit that the old version of you cannot guide you into your next life, that takes real masculine depth. So if you are in a season where life is undoing you, listen carefully. You may believe you are losing your power. You may believe you are falling behind. You may believe your confusion is proof that something has gone wrong. But what if this is the first honest moment of your life? What if the discomfort you feel is not punishment, but purification? What if the things falling away were never meant to define you? What if the ache in your chest is the sound of a deeper man knocking from within? What if surrender is not the end of your masculinity, but the beginning of its redemption? Because the awakened masculine is not born through endless conquest. He is born the moment a man stops worshiping the false gods of control, image, and emotional exile. He is born when a man chooses truth over appearance, presence over panic, alignment over performance, soul over survival pattern. And none of that begins until he learns the sacred meaning of surrender. Surrender is not laying down because you are weak. It is laying down what is false so you can stand in what is real. That is chapter 1. That is the threshold. That is the beginning of the road most men fear, but every awakened man must eventually walk. And once that door opens, life can never be seen the same way again. Because after surrender, a man no longer asks, "How do I control this?" He begins asking a far more powerful question. What is truth asking of me now? That is where awakening starts. That is where the real masculine begins. Chapter 2. Why the masculine ego resists letting go. There is a hidden prison many men live inside without ever calling it by its name. It is not made of iron bars. It is not built by society alone. It is not even enforced by other people as much as men like to believe. It is built inside the masculine ego. And one of its strongest walls is this belief: if I let go, I lose myself. This is why surrender feels so offensive to the unawakened masculine. Not because surrender is weak, but because the ego survives by attaching identity to control. It tells a man that his value is measured by how much he can manage, how much he can dominate, how much he can solve, how much he can endure without breaking. So he learns early to worship self-containment. Do not cry too much. Do not need too much. Do not feel too much. Do not show confusion. Do not reveal fear. Do not appear soft. Do not fail in public. Do not let life see where you are still wounded. And slowly, almost invisibly, he creates a version of himself built not on truth, but on defense. He becomes efficient, but not always alive. Capable, but not always connected. Respected, but not always known. Wanted perhaps, but rarely understood. He learns how to survive the world, but forgets how to inhabit his own soul. This is the tragedy of masculine conditioning when it is left unexamined. It trains a man to become impressive before he becomes integrated. From the outside, he may appear strong. He may be disciplined, accomplished, focused, even admired. But beneath the structure is often a quiet terror he has no language for. Because the ego knows something the soul has not yet fully admitted. If the mask comes off, everything unresolved will be exposed. That is what the masculine ego fears most. Not pain itself. Exposure. Exposure of the grief he buried. Exposure of the love he could not hold. Exposure of the insecurity beneath the ambition. Exposure of the exhaustion beneath the performance. Exposure of the little boy still trying to earn worth through control. The ego would rather keep a man busy than let him be honest. So it gives him endless assignments. Achieve more. Lift more. Earn more. Conquer more. Posture more. Protect the image. Maintain the role. Never let them see the fracture. Never let them know how tired you really are. Never admit that the life you fought so hard to build no longer feels like home. And because many men are rewarded for this performance, the ego becomes even stronger. People praise the composed man. They admire the man who seems unaffected. They trust the man who appears certain. They are drawn to the man who gives the impression of self-command. But what they often do not see is that appearance can be a highly polished form of avoidance. A man can look stable while being spiritually disconnected. He can look powerful while being emotionally numb. He can look disciplined while secretly being terrified of stillness. He can look masculine while being ruled entirely by fear. And fear, when hidden well, often disguises itself as control. That is why the masculine ego resists letting go. Because control is not only a behavior. It becomes a shield, a religion, a survival strategy, a false god. It promises safety. It says if you stay ahead of everything, nothing can break you. If you remain composed, no one can reject the real you. If you always lead, no one will discover how lost you feel. If you keep moving, you will never have to face what waits in silence. But control has a cost. The more a man worships control, the more fragmented he becomes. He loses access to spontaneity. He loses access to tenderness. He loses access to emotional truth. He loses access to surrender, to mystery, to trust, to the sacred intelligence of life moving beyond his plans. And eventually, he begins confusing rigidity with strength. This is one of the deepest distortions in the masculine journey. Because true masculine energy is not rigid. It is rooted. It is not brittle. It is steady. It does not need to force reality into submission. It can meet reality with presence. But the ego cannot understand presence. It only understands management. Presence requires trust. Management requires fear. Presence says, I can face what is here. The ego says, I must control what is here before it controls me. Can you see the difference? One comes from grounded power. The other comes from inner panic, wearing the costume of confidence. This is why so many men feel internally exhausted without knowing why. They are not only carrying work, duty, responsibility, and ambition. They are carrying an identity that must constantly be maintained. And maintenance is draining. To always be the strong one. To always know what to do. To always have the answer. To always appear emotionally contained. To always keep the machine running, even when your soul is on its knees. This kind of masculinity may function for a while. It may even produce results. But it cannot produce awakening. Because awakening begins where image loses its throne. It begins when a man can no longer tolerate the gap between who he appears to be and who he really is. That gap is where suffering multiplies. A man may say he wants peace, but if his ego is addicted to control, he will unconsciously create struggle. He may say he wants love, but if he is terrified of vulnerability, he will sabotage intimacy. He may say he wants purpose, but if his entire worth is tied to achievement, he will never feel enough once he reaches the goal. The ego does not know how to rest in being. It only knows how to earn, prove, protect, and defend. That is why letting go feels like annihilation. Because to the ego, surrender is not transformation. It feels like disappearance. It asks, if I stop performing, who am I? If I stop chasing, what remains? If I stop controlling every outcome, will life abandon me? If I stop being who they expect, will I still be loved? If I stop identifying with my role, my success, my strength, my detachment, then what is left of me? These are not surface questions. These are soul threshold questions. And most men spend years avoiding them by staying busy. Busy with goals. Busy with distractions. Busy with women. Busy with work. Busy with fitness. Busy with entertainment. Busy with self-improvement that never quite reaches the wound beneath the striving. Because the ego will even weaponize growth. It will turn healing into another performance. Another project. Another way to feel superior. Another badge to wear. Another structure to hide inside. But real awakening is far less glamorous than the ego wants. It often begins in humiliation, in heartbreak, in failure, in the moment a man realizes his methods no longer work. The relationship collapses. The success feels dead. The body burns out. The confidence cracks. The certainty vanishes. And suddenly, the ego has nothing left to stand on. This is the sacred crisis. Because when the masculine ego loses control, one of two things usually happens. Either the man doubles down and becomes more defensive, more bitter, more rigid, more performative. Or he begins to ask the question that changes everything. What if the thing I am defending is the very thing keeping me from becoming whole? That question is dangerous to the false self. Because once a man becomes willing to question the identity he has built, awakening is no longer far away. Then he starts seeing clearly. He sees that much of what he called strength was fear of being seen. Much of what he called leadership was fear of uncertainty. Much of what he called independence was fear of needing love. Much of what he called discipline was fear of slowing down. Much of what he called logic was fear of feeling. This does not mean masculine traits are bad. Not at all. Discipline is sacred. Leadership is sacred. Protection is sacred. Direction is sacred. But only when they arise from consciousness. When they arise from fear, they become distortion. Protection becomes control. Direction becomes domination. Discipline becomes suppression. Independence becomes emotional exile. Strength becomes theater. The awakened masculine does not reject masculinity. He redeems it. And that redemption cannot happen until the ego is seen for what it is. Not evil. Not shameful. But limited. The ego is a structure built to help a man survive pain. But survival is not the same as freedom. And at some point, every man who is meant to awaken must decide whether he will continue protecting the structure or begin listening to the soul beneath it. That decision changes everything. Because the soul does not ask a man to become weaker. It asks him to become real. Real enough to feel what he has avoided. Real enough to grieve what he has lost. Real enough to admit where he has been false. Real enough to stop using control as a substitute for inner peace. Real enough to release the image and enter the fire of truth. And the ego will resist every step of that journey. It will call stillness laziness. It will call vulnerability danger. It will call surrender failure. It will call honesty weakness. It will call softening losing your edge. But none of those voices are the voice of awakening. They are the final defense mechanisms of a false identity that knows its reign is ending. So if you are in a season where you feel resistance rising inside you, pay attention. If something in you wants to keep gripping, if something in you wants to prove, posture, chase, dominate, or avoid, if something in you is terrified of stillness, if something in you cannot stop trying to manage how you are seen, do not condemn yourself. But do not blindly obey it either. Because that resistance may be showing you exactly where your awakening wants to begin. The masculine ego resists letting go because it believes it is protecting your life. But often, it is only protecting your prison. And there comes a moment in every real spiritual journey when a man must choose. Will he keep defending the identity that helped him survive yesterday? Or will he trust the deeper dismantling that can make him whole tomorrow? That is the threshold. And once a man sees that his need for control is not proof of strength, but proof of fear, something begins to shift. He becomes less interested in looking powerful, more interested in becoming aligned, less interested in winning every battle, more interested in no longer being divided within himself, less interested in maintaining the image, more interested in embodying the truth. That is where the ego begins to loosen its grip. Not all at once, not dramatically, but honestly. And honesty is enough to begin. Because the moment a man stops calling fear strength, he is already awakening. The moment he stops worshiping control, he is already remembering. The moment he becomes willing to lose the mask, he is already being introduced to the face of the real man underneath. That is the deeper truth. The masculine ego resists letting go because it cannot imagine power without control. But the soul knows better. The soul knows that what is real does not need to be forced. What is aligned does not need to be performed. What is sacred does not need to be defended by fear. And sooner or later, every man must decide which voice he will follow. The ego that says grip tighter, or the deeper truth that whispers release. Chapter 3. The collapse that starts the awakening. There comes a moment in many men's lives that feels less like transformation and more like destruction. Nothing makes sense anymore. The strategies that once worked stop working. The discipline that once felt empowering starts to feel empty. The relationship he thought would anchor him slips through his hands. The ambition that once gave him fire no longer gives him meaning. The version of himself he spent years building begins to crack, and for the first time, he cannot simply outwork, outrun, or outthink what is happening inside him. This is the collapse. And to the unawakened mind, collapse feels like failure. It feels like punishment. It feels like loss of power. It feels like life turning against him. It feels humiliating, confusing, even cruel. But beneath the surface, something far more sacred is taking place. Because collapse is often not the destruction of the true man. It is the destruction of what the true man can no longer hide behind. That is why masculine awakening rarely begins in comfort. It rarely begins when life is smooth, when the ego is satisfied, when everything is under control. Most men do not question the false self when it is still producing results. They do not seek truth while illusion is still rewarding them. They do not surrender while the old identity is still giving them enough applause, enough distraction, enough momentum to avoid the deeper ache within. No. Awakening usually begins when life interrupts the performance. When the applause fades. When the relationship breaks. When the career success feels strangely hollow. When the body says no more. When the nights get quieter and the inner noise gets louder. When the man who looked strong to everyone else can no longer explain why he feels lost in his own skin. This is the beginning most men never see coming. Because collapse rarely announces itself as initiation. It shows up as heartbreak, burnout, betrayal, failure, rejection, exhaustion, loneliness. A season where everything that once made him feel certain suddenly feels unstable. And the deeper pain is not only that something external has fallen apart. It is that his inner structure is no longer strong enough to carry the weight of the illusion. This is why the collapse cuts so deep. It is not just the loss of a person, a goal, a title, or a direction. It is the collapse of the identity attached to those things. He is not only grieving what happened. He is grieving who he believed he was within it. The man who thought he could keep it together. The man who thought he could win love through effort. The man who thought success would finally make him feel whole. The man who thought being needed was the same as being loved. The man who thought control could save him from pain. All of that begins to tremble. And when it trembles, a terrifying question rises from the depths. If I am no longer who I thought I was, then who am I? That question is not a small one. It is one of the holiest questions a man can face. But first, it often feels like death. Because the masculine ego does not experience collapse as a neutral event. It experiences it as a threat to survival. It panics. It wants immediate solutions. It wants a new target, a new conquest, a new distraction, a new body, a new relationship, a new routine, a new philosophy. Anything to avoid sitting in the unbearable truth that the old self is falling apart. This is why many men miss the gift hidden inside collapse. They move too quickly to rebuild. They do not let the wreckage speak. They do not let the silence teach. They do not let the fire burn long enough to reveal what was false. Instead, they rush to restore the image. They want to get back to normal. They want to prove they are fine. They want to regain control before the soul has had a chance to reveal why control had to be broken in the first place. But the man who is truly meant to awaken cannot stay asleep forever. Eventually, the collapse becomes too honest to ignore. He begins to see that the pain is not random. The loss is not meaningless. The stripping away is not merely cruel. It is exposing the architecture of his false life. That sentence matters. Collapse exposes architecture. It shows a man what his life was built on. Was it built on truth or on performance? Was it built on purpose or on compensation? Was it built on inner peace or on outer validation? Was it built on love or on fear of abandonment? Was it built on deep masculine rootedness or on the desperate need to appear powerful? When collapse comes, those foundations are revealed. And if they are weak, they do not hold. This is why collapse is such a spiritual event, even when it looks like failure from the outside. Because in the ruins, a man finally sees what his ego never wanted him to see. He sees the relationship he was using to avoid himself. He sees the success he was using to earn worth. He sees the discipline that was really self-punishment. He sees the detachment that was really fear of intimacy. He sees the confidence that was really armor. He sees the ambition that was partly fueled by the need to outrun shame. And none of this is meant to condemn him. It is meant to free him. Because a man cannot become whole by continuing to worship what has been exposed as hollow. He must let it die. This is the brutal mercy of collapse. It does not ask for polite adjustment. It asks for surrender. It asks for honesty. It asks for the courage to stop pretending that what has fallen apart should be rebuilt in the same form. That is why collapse feels so disorienting. It is not merely taking something away. It is taking away the false stability that once kept him numb. Imagine a man who has spent his entire life living in a house with cracked foundations, but the walls are beautifully painted. From the outside, it looks impressive. Others admire it. He takes pride in it. He tells himself it is solid because he needs it to be solid. But one day the ground shifts, and the house begins to split. The walls fracture. The roof groans. The structure cannot hold. At first, he curses the shaking. But eventually, he realizes the shaking did not create the weakness. It revealed it. This is what collapse does to the masculine path. It reveals. And revelation is never comfortable when a man has built himself around avoidance. There are men who meet collapse and become bitter. They harden. They blame. They numb themselves. They become cynical about love, suspicious of life, addicted to self-protection. They tell themselves they have learned wisdom, when in truth they have only deepened their defenses. But there are other men. Men who, through tears they never expected and silences they never planned, begin to soften into truth. They stop asking only, "How do I fix this?" They begin asking, "What is this trying to show me?" That question changes everything. Because fixing seeks speed. Awakening seeks truth. And truth rarely arrives through force. Truth arrives when a man is stripped of the luxury of lying to himself. This is why heartbreak awakens some men more than success ever could. Because heartbreak exposes dependence, illusion, fantasy, immaturity, fear, and unresolved hunger. It reveals where he was reaching for completion through another person instead of becoming anchored within himself. It reveals how much of his identity was unconsciously tied to being chosen, validated, admired, or needed. This is why failure awakens some men more than achievement ever could. Because failure reveals whether his worth was rooted in his being or in his results. It reveals whether he knew how to stand in dignity without applause. It reveals whether he was pursuing a calling or merely pursuing proof. This is why burnout awakens some men more than productivity ever could. Because burnout exposes the violence a man can do to himself when he confuses exhaustion with devotion. It reveals the cost of living disconnected from rhythm, tenderness, rest, and soul. So when collapse comes, the deeper invitation is not merely to survive it. It is to listen. Listen to what the pain is uncovering. Listen to what the loss is dismantling. Listen to what the silence is saying now that the noise has fallen away. Listen to the part of you that no longer wants to live from performance. Listen to the deeper masculine intelligence inside you that has been buried beneath pressure and pride. Because collapse, in its highest purpose, is not the end of your path. It is the end of your impersonation. It is the end of the life that looked strong but lacked truth. It is the end of the pattern that made you functional but fragmented. It is the end of the identity that helped you survive but could not help you awaken. And yes, this ending hurts. It hurts because men are rarely taught how sacred endings can be. They are taught to win, build, endure, conquer, and maintain. But they are not often taught how to let something die with reverence. They are not often taught that grief can be holy. That disorientation can be a teacher. That the loss of who you were can be the doorway to who you were always meant to become. So they resist the death. They clutch the remains. They call back old versions of themselves. They try to reassemble the broken mask. They try to return to the old life, not because it was alive, but because it was familiar. But the awakened path does not allow a man to live forever inside what has already been exposed. Sooner or later, he must accept that collapse came for a reason. Not to humiliate him, not to erase him, but to initiate him. And initiation is never comfortable. Initiation takes a man beyond image, beyond pride, beyond dependency, beyond the shallow definitions of masculinity he inherited from wounded systems and unconscious models. It leads him into the wilderness, a place where he cannot perform his way out, a place where no one claps for his inner work, a place where he meets not the man he pretended to be, but the man he has become beneath the debris. This is where the real rebuilding begins. Not immediately, not with a motivational speech, not with a sudden breakthrough. First comes the emptying. First comes the honest inventory. First comes the grief. First comes the quiet. First comes the uncomfortable realization that much of what he once called me was simply adaptation. And then slowly the deeper self begins to emerge. A man less interested in appearances. A man less desperate for control. A man more willing to feel. A man more anchored in truth than in image. A man who has touched the bottom of his own illusion, and, because of that, can no longer be seduced by shallow forms of power. This is why collapse is not failure. It is revelation. It is demolition with a purpose. It is life saying, with terrifying love, you cannot enter the next chapter carrying a false self. So if you are in that season now, if everything feels like it is breaking, if the old confidence is gone, if the old map no longer works, if the silence feels heavier than you know how to carry, hear this clearly. You are not necessarily losing your life. You may be losing your costume. You are not necessarily being punished. You may be being purified. You are not necessarily falling apart in the meaningless sense. You may be being broken open. And broken open is very different from broken beyond repair. A seed also breaks before it grows. Night also deepens before dawn. The old skin also tears before renewal. So let the collapse teach you. Let it humble you. Let it empty what was false. Let it expose what cannot come with you. Let it strip away every borrowed identity that kept you disconnected from your own soul. Because the man who emerges from honest collapse is never the same. He may be quieter, but his silence will carry truth. He may be softer, but his softness will no longer be weakness. He may be less impressive to the world, but he will be more real in the eyes of the sacred. And in the end, that is what awakening asks of every man. Not that he avoid collapse, but that he allow collapse to become consecration. Not that he escape the fire, but that he let the fire reveal the gold. That is where masculine awakening truly begins. Not in the moment he finally has it all together, but in the moment he realizes the man he was pretending to be has fallen, and something deeper is now asking to rise. Chapter 4. The hidden difference between control and strength. There is a difference so subtle that many men spend half their lives confusing one for the other. They call it strength, but often it is only control. From the outside, the two can look almost identical. Both can appear disciplined. Both can appear calm. Both can appear powerful, composed, and hard to shake. Both can move with authority. Both can speak with certainty. Both can carry responsibility and make decisions under pressure. But beneath the surface, they are born from entirely different worlds. Control comes from fear. Strength comes from truth. And until a man understands that difference, he may spend years building a version of himself that looks powerful while secretly being ruled by anxiety, tension, and the relentless need to keep life from exposing him. This is one of the deepest traps in the masculine path. Because many men are taught very early that their worth is tied to their ability to maintain order. Stay composed. Stay ahead. Stay sharp. Stay useful. Stay in charge. Never let the emotions get too visible. Never let the uncertainty become public. Never let the world see you bleed. So they learn to manage everything. They manage their image. They manage their relationships. They manage their emotions. They manage how much softness they reveal. They manage what people think. They manage how much pain they allow themselves to feel. They manage even their spirituality, turning it into another structure of self-control rather than a surrender to deeper truth. And because this management can produce results, it becomes easy to mistake it for strength. But control is not the same as grounded power. Control is what a man reaches for when he does not trust what will happen if he loosens his grip. Strength is what remains when he no longer needs to grip at all. That is the hidden difference. Control says, I must hold everything together or everything will fall apart. Strength says, even if things fall apart, I will remain rooted in what is real. Control says, I need certainty before I can be at peace. Strength says, I can stay present even when certainty is gone. Control says, I must manage how I am perceived. Strength says, I would rather be truthful than impressive. Control is obsessed with outcome. Strength is devoted to alignment. That is why control is exhausting. A man living from control may look stable, but inwardly he is always bracing. His nervous system is rarely at rest. His mind is always scanning. His identity is always adjusting to prevent exposure, loss, rejection, or failure. He is never fully here, because part of him is always trying to control what comes next. He does not call it fear, of course. He may call it discipline. He may call it leadership. He may call it standards. He may call it masculine responsibility. And sometimes those words are not entirely false. But if his inner state is driven by panic, by image maintenance, by the need to dominate uncertainty, then what he is calling strength may actually be fear wearing polished armor. That armor can become very sophisticated. Some men control through silence, some through overachievement, some through emotional distance, some through perfectionism, some through intensity, some through constant productivity, some through hyperrationality, some through the need to always be the calmest, strongest, least affected person in the room. But here is the deeper question. What if the calm is not peace? What if it is suppression? What if the certainty is not wisdom? What if it is fragility that cannot tolerate the unknown? What if the distance is not maturity? What if it is fear of intimacy? What if the discipline is not devotion? What if it is self-protection disguised as virtue? This is where many men must become radically honest. Because the masculine ego loves to decorate fear with noble language. It would rather appear strong than be understood. It would rather maintain structure than enter vulnerability. It would rather control the atmosphere than reveal the storm inside. And for a time, this works. It helps him survive. It helps him achieve. It helps him avoid chaos. It helps him build a life that others may even admire. But eventually life tests every false foundation. And when that test comes, control begins to crack. Why? Because control depends on conditions. It feels powerful only when the environment stays manageable. Only when the relationship behaves predictably. Only when the body keeps performing. Only when success keeps arriving. Only when no one touches the hidden wound. Only when life allows the mask to remain intact. But strength does not depend on favorable conditions. That is why strength is sacred. Strength is not the ability to prevent life from shaking you. It is the ability to remain deeply rooted when it does. A strong man is not a man who never feels fear. He is a man who does not abandon truth because of it. A strong man is not one who avoids grief. He is one who can grieve without losing his center. A strong man is not one who dominates every situation. He is one who remains internally ordered even when the situation is messy. A strong man is not one who never breaks. He is one who allows what is false to break without mistaking that for the destruction of his soul. This is why true strength has softness in it. Not weakness. Softness. The softness to listen. The softness to feel. The softness to pause before reacting. The softness to tell the truth without aggression. The softness to admit when something hurts. The softness to let love touch the places control once guarded. Only the insecure masculine believes softness threatens strength. The awakened masculine understands that strength without softness becomes cruelty, rigidity, or emotional exile. Softness without strength becomes collapse. But when both are united, something rare is born. Presence. And presence is more powerful than control will ever be. Because presence does not need to dominate reality in order to meet it. It does not need to perform wisdom. It does not need to tighten every time life becomes unpredictable. It is wide enough to hold contradiction, steady enough to remain conscious in discomfort, mature enough to stop confusing reaction with authority. Think about the men who leave the deepest imprint on your soul. Rarely are they the loudest. Rarely are they the most controlling. Rarely are they the most image-conscious. Usually, they are the ones who feel deeply anchored. The ones whose calm does not feel forced. The ones whose words carry weight because they are not trying to prove anything. The ones who can face pain without dramatizing it and face love without running from it. The ones who do not make you feel managed but met. That is strength. It has gravity. It has inner spaciousness. It has the kind of confidence that does not need constant display. And this kind of strength can only emerge when a man stops worshiping control. Because control is ultimately a refusal to trust life. Not blindly, not foolishly, but spiritually. It is the belief that if he is not constantly tightening, adjusting, bracing, and protecting, then reality will devour him. So he becomes his own prison warden. He organizes everything, but cannot rest. He leads others, but cannot surrender. He protects his heart so thoroughly that nothing real can enter. He becomes so good at staying composed that he loses contact with what is alive inside him. And the tragedy is that the world may reward him for it. People may call him strong, reliable, sharp, unshakable, masculine. But deep inside, he knows something is missing. Because control can create order. It cannot create wholeness. Only truth can do that. Truth is what begins restoring a man to real strength. The truth that he is tired. The truth that he is afraid. The truth that he has been performing. The truth that his need to manage everything is costing him intimacy, peace, and inner freedom. The truth that his strength has sometimes been a refusal to feel. The truth that the image he works so hard to protect is not the same as a soul that is fully alive. This kind of truth is humbling. But humility is not humiliation. It is alignment. Humility is when a man stops trying to be more than human and finally becomes fully human in the most sacred sense. Honest, grounded, open, disciplined, yes, but no longer divided against himself. That is when strength begins to change form. It becomes less aggressive, more embodied. Less performative, more trustworthy. Less about force, more about integrity. Less about winning, more about remaining aligned. Less about control, more about conscious leadership of the self. This is the paradox many men must learn through pain. The more a man clings to control, the weaker he often becomes inside. The more he learns to stand in truth, the stronger he becomes without effort. Because what is real does not require constant tension to hold itself together. A tree with deep roots does not need to panic in the wind. It bends, but it does not betray its nature. It moves, but it does not lose its ground. Its strength is not in resisting every gust. Its strength is in being rooted enough to survive them. That is the image of awakened masculinity. Not frozen, not rigid, not obsessed with preserving appearance. Rooted. A rooted man can lead. A rooted man can love. A rooted man can protect. A rooted man can build. A rooted man can remain open without becoming weak and remain firm without becoming cruel. But none of that is possible if he is still confusing control with strength. So life, in its strange mercy, often forces the lesson. It removes the conditions that made control feel effective. It brings uncertainty. It brings heartbreak. It brings failure. It brings the kind of silence that control cannot solve. And in that silence, a man begins to discover what is actually holding him together. Not his image. Not his plans. Not his constant effort. Not his ability to manage outcomes. But his relationship to truth. That relationship becomes everything. Because once a man learns that strength is not the same as domination, he stops trying to conquer every feeling. He becomes willing to listen to what his emotions are revealing. He stops treating vulnerability like an enemy. He stops treating tenderness like a threat. He stops measuring manhood by how little he needs. Instead, he begins to ask better questions. Am I at peace or merely in control? Am I grounded or am I bracing? Am I leading from truth or from fear of losing authority? Am I calm or just disconnected from what I feel? Am I strong enough to be honest or only skilled enough to appear unaffected? These questions are uncomfortable, but they open the door to the deeper masculine. The masculine that does not need to dominate in order to feel secure. The masculine that can face the unknown without collapsing into panic. The masculine that can remain disciplined without becoming numb. The masculine that can love without grasping. The masculine that can lead without controlling. The masculine that can be still without feeling powerless. That is real strength. And the man who finds it is never the same. Because once he tastes the power of inner alignment, the old addiction to control begins to lose its seduction. He starts realizing that what he once called being in charge was often just fear trying to stay ahead of pain. He realizes that what he once called holding it all together was often just a refusal to let truth reorganize his life. And slowly, beautifully, he changes. He becomes less reactive, less defensive, less hungry for external proof. He becomes more honest, more spacious, more trustworthy in his own nervous system, more capable of standing in reality without forcing it into shape. That is what awakening does. It does not make a man passive. It makes him powerful in a different way. A quieter way. A deeper way. A way the world may not always understand, but the soul immediately recognizes. So if you're standing at that threshold now, if life is teaching you the difference between bracing and being rooted, between managing and trusting, between controlling and truly standing in your power, do not look away from the lesson. This distinction may change your life. Because the man who confuses control for strength will always be at war with uncertainty. But the man who discovers real strength becomes something else entirely. He becomes the kind of man who no longer needs to grip so tightly, because he has finally become someone who can stand in truth. Chapter 5. Why surrender feels so terrifying to men. There is a reason surrender feels unbearable to so many men. It is not because men are incapable of depth. It is not because the masculine is naturally closed. It is not because awakening is reserved for the rare few. It is because surrender threatens the identity a man has spent years, sometimes decades, building in order to survive. And what is built for survival rarely lets go without a fight. This is why surrender does not feel gentle at first. It feels dangerous. It feels humiliating. It feels disorienting. It feels like standing at the edge of a cliff and being asked to release the only thing you think is holding you up. To the soul, surrender is an opening. To the ego, surrender is death. That is the battle. Most men are not afraid of surrender because they love control for no reason. They are afraid because control became the way they learned to protect themselves from pain. It became the structure that helped them navigate rejection, uncertainty, shame, heartbreak, pressure, and the silent burden of feeling responsible for everything. Control gave them language. Control gave them movement. Control gave them an image they could hide inside. Control made them feel less helpless. So when life begins asking them to surrender, it is not merely asking them to stop controlling outcomes. It is asking them to question the very identity that made them feel safe. That is why the fear runs so deep. Because beneath the need to control is often a more vulnerable truth. What if I let go and nobody catches me? What if I stop performing and no one loves the real me? What if I soften and get hurt again? What if I tell the truth and it costs me everything? What if I surrender the image I built and discover there is nothing underneath it? What if the man I have been is all I know how to be? These are not logical fears. They are existential fears. And the masculine ego experiences them with great intensity, even if a man never says them out loud. He may simply feel restless, irritable, numb, overly focused on fixing things, compelled to distract himself, drawn to another goal, another habit, another chase. But beneath all that movement is often one central terror. If I stop gripping, I will disappear. This is why surrender can feel more threatening to men than failure itself. Failure still allows the ego to remain active. It can regroup, improve, try harder, make a comeback, reclaim the image. Failure still keeps the game alive. But surrender ends the game. Surrender says the old strategy is over. The old mask is no longer enough. The old identity cannot take you any further. The old version of strength must die. And for many men, that feels like psychological annihilation. Because if a man has built his life around being the one who handles it, solves it, protects it, leads it, wins it, or holds it all together, then surrender feels like betrayal of the very code he has lived by. He begins to wonder, if I am not the achiever, who am I? If I am not the rescuer, who am I? If I am not the strong silent one, who am I? If I am not the one in charge, who am I? If I stop reaching, striving, proving, managing, defending, then what exactly remains of me? This is where the deeper spiritual work begins. Because surrender is terrifying not only because a man fears losing something external. It is terrifying because he fears meeting himself without the structures that once protected him from that encounter. And many men have never truly met themselves. They have met their ambition, their discipline, their lust, their anger, their image, their social role, their wounds disguised as purpose. But to meet oneself beneath the noise, beneath the performance, beneath the armor, that is another thing entirely. That is why surrender often feels like walking into sacred nakedness. No titles, no applause, no certainty, no distraction, no carefully maintained identity to hide behind. Just truth. And truth is beautiful, but before it becomes beautiful, it often feels brutal. Because truth exposes where a man has been false, where he has been driven by fear, where he has used power to avoid tenderness, where he has used discipline to avoid grief, where he has used busyness to avoid emptiness, where he has used detachment to avoid the risk of being touched. This is the hidden terror of surrender. It does not merely remove what is false. It reveals what was being avoided beneath the falsehood. The grief he never processed, the father wound he never named, the heartbreak he still carries in silence, the shame that fuels his overachievement, the fear of being ordinary, the fear of being rejected, the fear that if he is not useful, successful, or needed, then he may not be worthy of love at all. Once these truths begin to rise, many men instinctively want to escape, not because they are weak, but because they were never taught that this terrain is sacred. They were taught how to win, how to compete, how to suppress, how to endure, how to rebuild, how to perform certainty. But they were not taught how to sit in the dark without making war against it. So they misread surrender. They think it means passivity. They think it means losing edge. They think it means becoming soft in a way that will make them vulnerable to the world's cruelty. They think it means abandoning ambition, discipline, leadership, and masculine essence. But that is not surrender. That is distortion. True surrender does not destroy masculine essence. It refines it. It removes what is egoic, so that what is essential can finally breathe. A man does not become less masculine through surrender. He becomes less false. And that difference changes everything. Still, the fear remains powerful because the process itself is uncomfortable. Surrender often begins when life strips away the places where a man used to source identity. A relationship ends. A career path loses meaning. A season of emotional numbness becomes impossible to ignore. A woman he cannot forget becomes a mirror he cannot escape. A silence enters his life that no amount of stimulation can cover. And suddenly he is left with himself. Not the performing self. Not the strategic self. Not the image-conscious self. The raw self. The self who aches. The self who doubts. The self who longs. The self who is tired of pretending. the self who cannot quite explain why outward success no longer feels like enough. This encounter can feel terrifying because it removes the illusion that a man can outrun his own soul. And once that illusion dies, he has a choice. He can go back to distraction, back to proving, back to another cycle of control and avoidance. Or he can stay in the discomfort, stay in the silence, stay in the trembling uncertainty of no longer knowing who he is, but sensing that something truer is trying to emerge. This staying is one of the bravest things a man can do, because surrender is not a dramatic gesture. It is often a quiet refusal to keep abandoning yourself. It is the moment a man says, "I will stop pretending I am fine when I am fractured. I will stop calling armor my nature. I will stop chasing what keeps leaving me empty. I will stop worshiping an identity that is built on fear. I will stop resisting the truths that keep returning in the dark." That decision may not look heroic to the outside world, but in the unseen realm of masculine awakening, it is monumental. Because the man who can remain present in surrender begins to discover something unexpected. He does not disappear. That is the great revelation. He feared surrender because he thought it would erase him. But instead, it reveals him. It strips away the performative layers and exposes a deeper center. A quieter center. A stronger center. A center not built on applause, conquest, or control, but on truth, consciousness, and inner rootedness. This is why surrender is terrifying at the threshold, but liberating on the other side. At first, it feels like falling. Then it becomes release. Then it becomes clarity. Then it becomes power of a completely different kind. Not the power of domination. Not the power of image. Not the power of being untouchable. But the power of being real. And real men are far more powerful than protected ones. A real man can love without losing himself. He can grieve without feeling emasculated. He can tell the truth without collapsing. He can lead without force. He can be still without feeling useless. He can soften without becoming weak. He can let life change him without interpreting change as defeat. But none of this becomes possible until he faces the terror directly. Not by pretending he is beyond fear, but by admitting that fear is there and continuing inward anyway. That is courage. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to stop obeying it. So many men spend years trying to feel powerful by becoming harder. Harder to reach. Harder to wound. Harder to read. Harder to move. Harder to love. But awakening often asks for the opposite. Not weakness. Not collapse into passivity. But permeability to truth. A man must become open enough to be transformed. And transformation always feels dangerous to the part of him that survives through sameness. That is why surrender feels so terrifying. Because it asks a man to trust that what is falling away is not his essence, but his prison. It asks him to trust that the shaking is not always destruction, but revelation. It asks him to trust that he can lose the mask without losing the soul. It asks him to trust that the death of false power is the birth of real authority. This trust is not naive. It is earned through fire. A man begins to trust surrender when he realizes that all the things he clung to never truly gave him peace. They gave him temporary certainty, temporary identity, temporary momentum. But not peace. Peace arrives differently. Peace arrives when the war with reality ends. Peace arrives when a man no longer needs to constantly manufacture a self. Peace arrives when he can sit in truth, however uncomfortable, without trying to edit it into something easier. Peace arrives when he stops needing his life to look powerful and becomes willing for it to become sacred instead. This is the deeper invitation. And this is why surrender is not for the shallow self. It is for the man who is ready to stop performing masculinity and begin embodying it. It is for the man who is tired of control without connection. It is for the man who is tired of power without peace. It is for the man who senses that his next evolution will not come through more force, but through deeper honesty. So if surrender feels terrifying to you, that does not mean you are weak. It may mean you are standing at the edge of something real. If you feel resistance, if you feel panic, if you feel the urge to run back into distraction, work, lust, anger, or endless self-improvement, pause before you obey it. Ask yourself, what part of me is afraid of dying here? And is it my soul? Or only the mask? That question can open a door. Because once a man sees that it is not his essence being threatened, but only the false structure built around it, something begins to soften. The fear may not vanish immediately, but it loses its absolute authority. And in that moment, surrender stops being a terrifying abyss. It becomes a sacred threshold. The threshold where the old man trembles. The threshold where the ego bargains. The threshold where illusion weakens. The threshold where truth begins to breathe. And if he stays there long enough, without running, without pretending, without reaching for the old armor, he discovers what few men are taught, but every awakened man eventually learns. What terrified him most was never the end of his power. It was the beginning of his freedom. Chapter 6. The silence where the new man is formed. There is a place most men spend their lives trying to avoid. Silence. Not just outer silence, but inner silence. The kind that comes when the noise dies down, when the messages stop, when the distractions lose their flavor, when the chase no longer numbs, when even achievement cannot drown out what is rising from within. This is the place where many men begin to panic, because silence removes the escape routes. In noise, a man can hide. In activity, he can postpone. In pleasure, he can sedate. In ambition, he can redirect the ache into motion. In relationships, he can seek reflection instead of revelation. In constant stimulation, he can convince himself he is alive while remaining disconnected from his own depths. But silence is merciless in the most sacred way. It does not flatter the ego. It does not rush to comfort illusion. It does not help a man keep pretending he is whole when he is inwardly divided. Silence reveals. And that is why it feels so uncomfortable at first. Because when a man enters silence, he begins hearing what he once outran. He hears the grief he buried beneath discipline. He hears the fear he masked with confidence. He hears the loneliness he covered with lust or achievement. He hears the exhaustion underneath the performance. He hears the old wounds speaking in the language of anger, numbness, and restlessness. He hears the younger self still waiting to be acknowledged by the man he became. This is why silence can feel heavier than struggle. At least in struggle, the masculine ego has something to do. Something to solve. Something to fight. Something to prove. Something to conquer. But in silence, there is no enemy outside to distract from the truth inside. There is only presence. And presence is unbearable to the false self. Because the false self survives through movement, through control, through image, through the constant management of how life appears and how pain is postponed. Silence interrupts all of that. It asks nothing flashy. It offers no immediate applause. It gives no quick identity. It simply places a man in front of himself and waits. That waiting is holy. Because many men do not realize that what feels like emptiness in silence is often the beginning of reorganization. Not the kind the ego can manage, but the kind the soul begins when it finally has room to speak. This is the mystery. From the outside, silence looks like nothing. No visible victory. No dramatic progress. No obvious proof that life is moving forward. But beneath the surface, entire worlds are being dismantled and rebuilt. Beliefs are being questioned. Defenses are being exposed. Old identities are losing their grip. Forgotten truths are returning. A new relationship with pain is being born. A deeper form of masculinity is beginning to breathe. This is why so many true awakenings begin in solitude. Not because isolation is inherently noble. Not because a man must abandon the world to become whole. But because there are parts of the masculine soul that can only be heard when the outer noise softens enough for inner truth to rise. A man may not choose this season. Sometimes silence comes after heartbreak, after loss, after betrayal, after burnout, after a collapse that strips away the noise he once relied on. Sometimes life corners him into stillness because movement was no longer leading him toward truth. At first, he may resist. He may reach for another distraction, another habit, another woman, another ambition, another self-improvement system, another external structure to avoid the unbearable intimacy of sitting with himself. But if the awakening is real, these things stop working the way they used to. The pleasure fades faster. The distractions feel thinner. The performance feels heavier. The borrowed identities no longer fit. The old life starts feeling loud, brittle, and spiritually expensive. And then a strange thing begins to happen. Silence, once terrifying, becomes a teacher. Not instantly. Not romantically. Not without discomfort. But gradually, a man starts to realize that silence is not empty. It is full. Full of messages he was too defended to hear. Full of truths he was too busy to face. Full of pain that was waiting not to destroy him, but to be integrated. Full of wisdom that could not reach him while he was addicted to stimulation. This is where the new man begins to form. Not in the spotlight. Not in the moment he is most admired. Not in the season where everything is easy and externally affirmed. But in the unseen place. In the quiet room. In the long walk. In the sleepless night. In the breath between reactions. In the moment he chooses not to run. In the moment he sits still enough to let what is real rise to the surface. This formation is subtle. The new man is not built through egoic construction. He is uncovered through sacred subtraction. A little less pretending. A little less chasing. A little less self-betrayal. A little less dependence on noise. A little less need to always appear strong. A little less worship of control. A little less attachment to the identity that kept him functional but disconnected. And through that subtraction, something deeper emerges. Not a louder man. A truer one. Not a harder man. A more grounded one. Not a more impressive man. A more integrated one. This is the paradox of masculine awakening. The world often tells men to become more by adding. More success. More confidence. More skill. More influence. More strategy. More optimization. But the soul often awakens through removal. The removal of illusion. The removal of false certainty. The removal of compulsive striving. The removal of identities built on fear. The removal of emotional armoring mistaken for maturity. Silence is the place where this removal happens. And because so much is being stripped away, a man in silence may feel lost for a time. He may ask himself, why do I feel disconnected from what once motivated me? Why does everything seem slower? Why do I no longer want what I used to chase? Why does stillness feel both painful and strangely necessary? Why do I feel like something is ending, even if I cannot name it? These are not signs that he is broken. They are often signs that his old operating system is dying. And what dies first is usually the addiction to external confirmation. In silence, no one is clapping. No one is validating the inner work. No one is handing him an identity to wear. No one is reassuring him that the discomfort means progress. So he must begin learning a new kind of trust. Trust in process. Trust in truth. Trust in what is being reshaped, even when he cannot yet see the final form. Trust that stagnation and gestation can look very similar from the outside. Trust that the absence of noise is not the absence of life. This trust matures him. Because immature masculinity wants immediate proof, immediate direction, immediate momentum, immediate evidence that the process is worth it. But deeper masculinity learns to endure mystery without collapsing into panic. It learns to wait without abandoning itself. It learns to listen without forcing conclusions. It learns to hold tension without rushing to escape. It learns to stay in the dark long enough for real sight to develop. This is what silence trains. It trains nervous system honesty. It trains spiritual patience. It trains emotional courage. It trains a man to stop reacting to every inner discomfort as if it were an emergency. It trains him to witness his thoughts, desires, fears, and wounds without instantly becoming possessed by them. That is profound power. Because a man who cannot be alone with himself cannot truly lead himself. And a man who cannot lead himself will eventually try to control others, circumstances, or outcomes in order to compensate for the chaos within. This is why silence is so foundational. It returns a man to his own inner authority. Not the authority of domination, the authority of self-presence. He begins noticing what once ruled him unconsciously. The need to be wanted, the hunger to prove, the fear of being ordinary, the reflex to withdraw instead of feel, the habit of turning pain into productivity, the compulsion to stay busy so he never has to face the emptiness beneath the movement. Silence shines light on all of it. Not to shame him, but to free him. Because once something is seen clearly, it no longer controls him in quite the same way. This is where many men begin to soften toward themselves for the first time. Not with indulgence, not with weakness, but with honesty. They begin to understand that much of what they called personality was adaptation. Much of what they called standards was fear. Much of what they called independence was unresolved hurt. Much of what they called ambition was partly an attempt to outrun a feeling of not being enough. And in silence, none of this can remain purely conceptual. It becomes lived revelation. A man feels it in his chest, in his breath, in the tension in his body, in the grief rising unexpectedly, in the memories surfacing, in the exhaustion that comes from no longer being able to perform his way through life. This can be disorienting, but it is also sacred evidence that he is no longer asleep. Because the sleeping man only knows how to move. The awakening man learns how to remain. And in remaining, he becomes available to a different intelligence. An intelligence deeper than impulse. Deeper than ego. Deeper than inherited masculine scripts. He begins hearing the voice beneath the noise. A quieter voice. A steadier voice. A voice that does not shout, but does not lie. A voice that says, slow down. Tell the truth. Stop reaching for what empties you. Grieve what you lost. Release what you cannot carry into the next chapter. Become the man who can stay. This is the voice of inner reformation. And it does not make a man passive. It makes him precise. He becomes more intentional with his energy, more selective with his words, more aware of what drains him, more resistant to shallow stimulation, more interested in depth than display, more committed to peace than performance. This is what the silence is producing. Not weakness. Weight. The kind of inner weight that gives his presence gravity. The kind of gravity that does not need noise to be felt. The kind of maturity that makes a man trustworthy, not because he is perfect, but because he is no longer running from himself. So if you are in a season of silence, do not misread it. The stillness may feel like loss, but it may be preparation. The loneliness may feel like abandonment, but it may be separation from what could no longer accompany your becoming. The confusion may feel like emptiness, but it may be the clearing of inner ground for something truer to take root. Do not rush to fill the quiet just because it exposes what hurts. Stay long enough to learn what the silence knows. Because the new man is rarely formed in public. He is formed where no one is watching, where excuses stop working, where the image collapses, where the soul finally has enough room to breathe. He is formed in the prayer no one hears, in the tear no one applauds, in the restraint no one notices, in the truth he tells himself when there is no audience, in the stillness that teaches him he can survive his own depths. And when he emerges from that silence, he is different. Not because he found a new performance, but because he stopped needing one. He has touched something deeper than validation. He has learned that peace cannot be downloaded from the world. He has discovered that clarity is not forced, but received. He has become the kind of man who no longer fears stillness, because stillness has shown him who he really is. That is where the new man is formed. Not in the noise of becoming someone, but in the silence where he finally stops abandoning who he already is. Chapter 7. The Feminine Mirror and the Awakening Trigger. There are moments in a man's life when truth does not arrive through solitude alone. It arrives through a mirror. And very often, that mirror appears in feminine form. Not because woman exists to complete man. Not because masculine awakening depends entirely on romance. Not because every intense connection is sacred by default. But because the feminine has a way of revealing what the masculine has been hiding from itself. This is one of the most unsettling parts of the journey. A man can avoid himself for years in the worlds of work, ambition, fitness, success, discipline, and performance. He can build an image, maintain a role, even convince himself that he is whole because he functions well. He can move through life appearing grounded, capable, self-contained. Then someone enters. And suddenly, everything he thought he had mastered begins to shake. His emotions intensify. His inner contradictions become harder to ignore. His avoidance patterns become visible. His fear of vulnerability rises to the surface. His need for control is triggered. His deepest longings begin speaking in a voice he can no longer silence. This is why certain feminine connections feel so disruptive. They do not merely offer affection. They reveal fracture. The feminine mirror does not create all his wounds. It exposes them. That distinction matters. Because many men misunderstand the role of these encounters. They think the woman caused their instability. They think she made them weak, confused, needy, emotional, distracted, or spiritually disoriented. They think the problem began with her presence. But often, what truly happened is simpler and deeper. She activated what was already there. The unprocessed grief. The hidden hunger for love. The fear of being fully seen. The ache beneath the armor. The longing to rest from performance. The terror of surrender. The part of him that wanted intimacy, but had built his life around emotional control. She did not invent these things. She illuminated them. An illumination can feel brutal when a man has spent years avoiding the inner rooms she suddenly brings light into. This is why the feminine mirror is often experienced as both beautiful and dangerous. Beautiful because something in him feels seen. Dangerous because something in him feels exposed. He may feel drawn in ways he cannot explain. He may feel more alive, more open, more inspired, more protective, more devotional, more aware of his own emotional depth. And at the same time, he may feel terrified. Terrified of losing control. Terrified of being known. Terrified of not being enough. Terrified of needing too much. Terrified that love might demand the death of the carefully managed self he has spent years constructing. This is where many men begin to run. Not always physically. Sometimes emotionally. Sometimes spiritually. Sometimes through silence. Sometimes through mixed signals. Sometimes through detachment disguised as maturity. Sometimes through logic that is really fear trying to reclaim territory. Why? Because the feminine mirror does not simply invite closeness. It invites transformation. And transformation is rarely what the ego wants when it first encounters real intimacy. The masculine ego would prefer admiration without exposure, desire without vulnerability, connection without accountability, inspiration without surrender, love without having to examine the structures of control, pride, fear, and emotional immaturity that have governed his life. But certain women, certain connections, certain soul-level encounters do not allow that bargain. They stir something deeper. A man may meet a woman and feel that she is not merely interacting with his personality. She is touching his essence. She is seeing through the performance, through the strength display, through the self-protective scripts, through the carefully maintained identity. She is speaking to a place beneath all of that. And if he is not ready, this can feel unbearable. Because to be truly seen is one of the deepest desires of the masculine soul, and one of its deepest fears. The desire says, finally, someone sees me beneath the armor. The fear says, if she sees me, then she will also see where I am unfinished. This tension creates immense pressure. A man may feel called upward by the feminine, called into more honesty, more presence, more emotional courage, more responsibility for the ways he has used distance, control, or performance to avoid real intimacy. But he may also resent the mirror for what it shows him. He may blame the connection for his instability. He may withdraw to regain composure. He may tell himself he just needs space, when what he really needs is the courage to face what has been activated. This is why the feminine mirror is such a powerful awakening trigger. Not because the woman saves him. She does not. Not because she is responsible for his evolution. She is not. And not because the relationship must end in union, romance, or lifelong partnership to have meaning. That too is not the point. The point is that some feminine presences awaken a man to truths he can no longer comfortably ignore. She becomes a catalyst, a revealer, a mirror, a spiritual disruption, a living confrontation with the gap between the man he appears to be and the man he actually is. This is especially true when the woman embodies qualities the wounded masculine has both longed for and feared. Depth, softness, emotional truth, intuition, patience, receptivity, inner power without performance, a calm that does not need to dominate, a love that does not chase but does not lie. These qualities can deeply unsettle a man whose masculinity has been built around control, speed, certainty, and self-protection. Why? Because the feminine, in its healthiest form, does not respond well to false power. It may be briefly impressed by image, but it is nourished by presence. It does not feel safe in domination. It feels safe in grounded truth. So when a man meets a feminine mirror, he often begins to see that the strategies that made him seem strong do not create real intimacy. His emotional distance does not create safety. His control does not create trust. His detachment does not create maturity. His avoidance does not create freedom. His performative confidence does not create depth. This realization can be humiliating, but it is holy, because humiliation, when received consciously, can become humility. And humility is where masculine awakening deepens. He begins to understand that he does not need to become less masculine in order to love well. He needs to become less defended. He does not need to lose direction. He needs to lose distortion. He does not need to abandon strength. He needs to stop confusing strength with emotional exile. This is one of the hidden gifts of the feminine mirror. She reveals not only his wounds, but his potential. She reflects the man he could become if he stopped running. The man who can remain open without collapsing. The man who can stay present when intimacy touches his fear. The man who can tell the truth instead of disappearing. The man who can hold both desire and discipline. The man who can meet the feminine not with control, but with conscious groundedness. This is why some men feel that a certain connection changed them forever, even if it did not become what they expected. Because the purpose of the connection may not have been comfort. It may have been awakening. An awakening often arrives through disruption. A man may lose the woman and still keep the mirror. He may leave the relationship and still be haunted by what it revealed. He may try to move on externally while inwardly knowing that something essential was activated and cannot be put back to sleep. This haunting is not always obsession. Sometimes it is unfinished initiation. It is life refusing to let him return to unconsciousness. He may ask himself, why did this connection affect me so deeply? Why can I not dismiss it like the others? Why did it expose so much in me? Why did it make me confront parts of myself I had spent years managing? Why did it feel like love, fear, longing, grief, devotion, and terror all at once? Because some connections are not merely emotional experiences. They are spiritual confrontations. And in those confrontations, the feminine often serves as the trigger that awakens the dormant masculine soul. Again, not by doing the work for him, but by igniting the need for the work. This is an important distinction, because immature men often romanticize the feminine mirror without maturing through it. They become addicted to the intensity, the longing, the idealization, the fantasy of reunion, the emotional charge. They circle the mirror, but never actually change. That is not awakening. That is attachment wearing spiritual language. True awakening means the mirror leads inward. It pushes a man into accountability, into self-examination, into shadow work, into honesty about where he has been emotionally unavailable, prideful, controlling, or dependent on external validation. If the connection only makes him long but never makes him grow, then he is still asleep inside the feeling. But if the connection becomes the doorway through which he begins confronting his fear of surrender, his unresolved wounds, his distorted masculine patterns, then the mirror has served its sacred purpose. Then even pain becomes meaningful. This is why the awakened masculine eventually stops blaming the feminine mirror for the chaos she stirred. He begins thanking the revelation, even if it came through heartbreak. He sees that what felt like disruption was actually exposure. What felt like rejection was often redirection. What felt like emotional unraveling was the breakdown of structures that could no longer hold truth. And slowly, he becomes less obsessed with possessing the mirror and more devoted to becoming the man the mirror called forth. That shift is profound. At first, he wanted the connection to soothe his wounds. Now he wants to heal them. At first, he wanted the woman to confirm his worth. Now he wants to root his worth in truth. At first, he wanted union without transformation. Now he understands that real union, with anyone, requires transformation. At first, he wanted the mirror to stop showing him his fracture. Now he understands that seeing the fracture was grace. That is when the feminine trigger becomes true initiation. The man stops asking only, how do I get her back? Or how do I stop feeling this? Or why did this happen to me? He begins asking deeper questions. What did this awaken in me? What truth did this connection expose? What part of me ran from being seen? What part of me mistook control for strength? What part of me still does not know how to stay present in love? What kind of man am I being asked to become now? Those questions mark a turning point. Because the feminine mirror is not ultimately about her. It is about what her presence made impossible to ignore. And when a man accepts that, something sacred begins. He stops worshiping the trigger and begins honoring the transformation. He stops romanticizing pain and begins extracting wisdom from it. He stops using distance as power and begins practicing presence as strength. This is how masculine awakening matures. Not through fantasy, through truth. Not through chasing intensity, through integrating revelation. Not through being completed by a woman, through becoming conscious in the presence of what she reflected. So if you have known a connection that shook your identity, stirred your deepest fears, exposed your avoidance, awakened longing you could not explain, and forced you to confront the difference between image and truth, do not dismiss it too quickly. Do not idolize it either. Honor it. Honor the mirror for what it showed. Honor the disruption for what it revealed. Honor the feminine trigger not as your savior, but as a messenger. Because sometimes the soul sends a mirror before it sends clarity. Sometimes it sends a woman whose presence makes your old life intolerable. Sometimes it sends love not first to comfort you, but to uncover you. Sometimes it sends connection as a summons to become more honest, more grounded, more whole, more capable of standing in masculine truth without armor. And the man who answers that summons does not emerge unchanged. He emerges with deeper eyes, a quieter ego, a more reverent heart, a less performative strength. He becomes the kind of man who understands that the feminine was never sent merely to be chased, possessed, or blamed. She was, in many cases, the mirror through which he first saw the distance between who he had been and who his soul was asking him to become. Chapter 8. What masculine awakening actually looks like. There comes a point in the journey where a man must stop speaking about awakening as if it were only a feeling, a concept, or a poetic idea. Because real awakening has evidence. Not performative evidence. Not social media evidence. Not the evidence of sounding spiritually intelligent. Not the evidence of using deep language while living the same unconscious patterns underneath it. Real awakening changes a man in ways that can be felt. It changes the way he carries silence, the way he responds to pain, the way he speaks when emotions rise, the way he handles desire, the way he moves through uncertainty, the way he loves, the way he leads, the way he stands in truth when nobody is watching. This is where many people become confused. They imagine awakening as a dramatic breakthrough, a mystical high, a sudden personality shift, or a season of emotional intensity that makes them feel deeper than everyone around them. They think if a man feels devastated enough, introspective enough, romantic enough, spiritual enough, then he must be awakening. But pain alone is not awakening. Intensity alone is not awakening. Insight alone is not awakening. Awakening is what happens when truth becomes embodied. And embodiment always leaves traces. You can see it in how a man no longer reacts the way he once did. Before awakening, he may have needed to control every emotional environment around him. He may have become defensive the moment he felt misunderstood. He may have used distance as protection, anger as armor, silence as punishment, achievement as self-worth, and avoidance as his primary strategy for dealing with vulnerability. After awakening begins to take root, something shifts. He becomes slower to react. Not because he has become emotionally numb, but because he has developed space inside himself. That space is one of the first visible signs. A man who is awakening no longer needs to respond to every discomfort as if it were a threat to his identity. He can feel tension without immediately reaching for control. He can hear something difficult without collapsing into defensiveness. He can sit with an uncomfortable truth without instantly turning it into blame, withdrawal, or performance. That does not mean he becomes passive. It means he becomes present. And presence is one of the clearest marks of masculine awakening. Not just physical presence, energetic presence, moral presence, emotional presence. He is more here. When he speaks, there is less noise in it. When he listens, there is less agenda in it. When he loves, there is less grasping in it. When he leads, there is less insecurity in it. He is no longer trying so hard to be seen as powerful, because something in him has become more interested in being aligned than being admired. This is why awakening often makes a man quieter. Not weaker. Quieter. He becomes less addicted to unnecessary explanation. Less hungry to prove his point. Less eager to dominate every room. Less interested in impressing people who cannot feel truth anyway. He begins to understand that real authority is not loud. It has weight. It has steadiness. It has a certain internal order that others can sense even before he says much at all. Another sign of masculine awakening is emotional honesty. This one is often misunderstood because emotional honesty does not mean uncontrolled emotional expression. It does not mean a man becomes erratic, overexposed, or lost in his feelings. It means he stops lying to himself about what he feels. That is a profound difference. He can say, "This hurt me." He can say, "I was afraid." He can say, "I wanted control because I felt helpless." He can say, "I was performing strength when I was actually in pain." He can say, "I used distance because intimacy exposed something in me I did not know how to hold." This honesty makes him more trustworthy. Because one of the most dangerous men in the world is not the man who feels deeply. It is the man who feels deeply but remains unconscious of what those feelings are doing inside him. The awakened masculine becomes conscious. He starts noticing his impulses before they become actions. He starts noticing the difference between intuition and fear. He starts noticing when his ego wants control, when his wounds want validation, when his pride wants to retreat, when his body is bracing, when his silence is truth, and when his silence is avoidance. This self-awareness is not glamorous, but it is powerful, because a man who can witness himself clearly becomes much less likely to be ruled by what he has not examined. And that changes everything. He becomes more accountable. This is another major sign of real awakening. An awakening man stops making excuses for the patterns that wound others and wound himself. He no longer hides behind masculine myths like, "This is just how men are," or "I'm just focused," or "I need space," when that space is really emotional unavailability. He stops romanticizing his avoidance. He stops glorifying his detachment. He stops confusing unresolved wounds with personality. Instead, he takes responsibility. He asks, where was I dishonest? Where did I disappear instead of communicate? Where did I try to control instead of trust? Where did I seek validation instead of standing in self-respect? Where did I ask someone else to carry what I had refused to face in myself? This kind of accountability is rare because it requires humility. And humility is one of the clearest fruits of awakening. Not self-rejection. Not shame. Humility. The humility to know he is still a man in process. The humility to see where he has been immature. The humility to accept that pain does not make him automatically wise. The humility to understand that insight without discipline changes very little. The humility to let life correct him. This humility does not make him smaller. It makes him more real. And reality is where genuine confidence is born. Before awakening, confidence may have been built on comparison, performance, achievement, image, attention, or control. But after awakening begins to mature, confidence becomes quieter and less dependent on external reinforcement. He does not need to be constantly desired to feel worthy. He does not need to be constantly winning to feel masculine. He does not need to be constantly in charge to feel secure. He does not need to be constantly understood to remain rooted. That is grounded confidence. It comes from inner congruence. Congruence is a powerful word here. An awakening man becomes more congruent. His words begin matching his energy. His values begin matching his behavior. His spiritual language begins matching the way he actually treats people. His longing for depth begins matching his willingness to do the inner work required for depth. He becomes less fragmented. And fragmentation is one of the great afflictions of the unawakened masculine. A man may say he wants love, but fear intimacy. He may say he wants peace, but feed chaos. He may say he wants purpose, but chase validation. He may say he values truth, but preserve image. He may say he wants union, but refuse transformation. Awakening begins healing this split. Not all at once, but meaningfully. The awakened masculine starts becoming the same man in private that he presents in public. He becomes less divided between what he says and what he lives. He stops outsourcing his center to attention, lust, ambition, or approval. That creates discipline of a higher order. Not punishment-based discipline. Sacred discipline. The discipline to remain present when escape would be easier. The discipline to tell the truth when performance would be safer. The discipline to hold desire without being ruled by it. The discipline to regulate his nervous system instead of projecting his chaos onto others. The discipline to stay with discomfort long enough for wisdom to emerge. This kind of discipline is deeply attractive, but not in the shallow sense. It is attractive because it feels safe. It feels grounded. It feels coherent. And coherence is one of the most masculine qualities a man can embody. Another sign of awakening is patience. An unawakened man often wants immediate relief. Immediate validation. Immediate answers. Immediate movement. Immediate proof that things are working. An awakening man becomes less ruled by urgency. He learns that not everything real unfolds quickly. He learns that forcing timing often distorts outcomes. He learns that some truths can only be received slowly. He learns that becoming the man he is meant to be is not a performance sprint, but a sacred reordering. So he becomes more patient with process. Not passive. Patient. He can wait without collapsing. He can feel desire without turning it into desperation. He can endure uncertainty without immediately trying to dominate it. He can trust what is forming even if he cannot yet name it fully. This patience is another form of power. So is discernment. As awakening deepens, a man becomes less available for what drains him. He becomes more selective with where he places his attention. He notices when certain environments pull him back into performance. He notices when certain relationships reward his false self instead of calling forth his true self. He notices when his body tightens around something that looks good externally, but is misaligned internally. He begins choosing from depth rather than compulsion. This changes how he loves too. An awakening man no longer approaches love as conquest, validation, rescue, or emotional anesthesia. He approaches it with more reverence, more self-awareness, more honesty about what he can hold and what he still needs to heal. He becomes less fascinated with fantasy and more devoted to reality. Less interested in being desired by many and more interested in becoming trustworthy to one. Less likely to disappear when intimacy gets real. Less likely to perform devotion without the inner substance to sustain it. That does not mean he becomes perfect in love, but he becomes responsible in love. And responsibility is one of the most overlooked signs of masculine awakening. Not the dry kind of responsibility, the sacred kind. The willingness to become someone whose presence does not create unnecessary confusion, whose words mean something, whose silence is not manipulation, whose pursuit is not selfish, whose retreat is not cowardice disguised as wisdom, whose heart is no longer a battlefield everyone else has to survive. This is what awakening actually looks like. It looks like a man becoming inhabitable. A man who can inhabit himself, his body, his truth, his feelings, his boundaries, his commitments, his values, his spiritual path. Because the unawakened masculine is often uninhabited. It is a structure without full presence, a role without deep embodiment, a performance without rooted soul. Awakening fills the structure with life. And once that happens, even his ambition changes. He may still build, still lead, still desire excellence, still pursue purpose, still cultivate his body, discipline, career, and mission. But the fuel is different now. He no longer builds just to be seen. He builds to express alignment. He no longer leads to dominate. He leads to serve truth. He no longer works to outrun himself. He works from a self he is learning to respect. He no longer seeks success as compensation. He seeks it as a channel for contribution and integrity. That difference is everything. Because when the fuel changes, the man changes. The same actions can now come from an entirely different soul. That is why awakening is not about abandoning masculinity. It is about purifying it. It is about removing the fear, pride, and performance that distorted masculine energy, so what remains is clean, clear, grounded, protective without being controlling, strong without being hard, open without being directionless, still without being passive, loving without losing structure, powerful without needing to prove it. This is the man that emerges. Not suddenly, not flawlessly, but unmistakably. You can feel when a man is becoming this. There is less chaos around him, less confusion in his energy, less contradiction between his words and his way of being. He may still struggle. He may still have wounds. He may still have moments of fear, grief, uncertainty, or retreat. But even in those moments, something is different. He comes back to truth more quickly. He recovers without hiding behind illusion. He does not worship his wounds. He learns from them. He does not make pain his identity. He makes it part of his initiation. That is what masculine awakening actually looks like. It looks like integrity under pressure, truth in motion, humility with backbone, presence with fire, softness with direction, discipline with soul. It looks like a man no longer trying to appear awakened. It looks like a man becoming real enough that awakening is no longer something he talks about. It is something he carries. Chapter 9. The Shocking Truth. Surrender is the gateway to authority. There is a truth so paradoxical that most men do not recognize it until life has humbled them enough to receive it. The man becomes most powerful not when he controls everything. He becomes most powerful when he no longer needs to. This is the threshold where masculine awakening turns into masculine authority. Not image, not performance, not borrowed confidence, not the brittle authority of domination, force, intimidation, or emotional distance. Real authority, the kind that cannot be faked for long, the kind that is felt before it is explained, the kind that does not depend on applause, fear, status, or external compliance, the kind that rises from inner order. And the shocking truth is that this kind of authority is born through surrender. This is the part many men resist, because they have been conditioned to believe that authority comes from mastery over circumstances, from command, from control, from having answers, from staying unaffected, from keeping the upper hand, from never exposing uncertainty, from projecting certainty so convincingly that no one dares question their strength. But this model is incomplete. It may create influence. It may create status. It may create temporary obedience. It may even create admiration. But it does not create deep authority. Why? Because anything built on fear of losing control is still enslaved. It may look powerful on the outside, but inwardly it is dependent. Dependent on conditions, dependent on image, dependent on outcomes, dependent on maintaining a particular identity in the eyes of others. That is not freedom. And authority without freedom is always fragile. This is why surrender becomes the gateway. Because surrender breaks the hidden dependencies. It breaks the dependency on being right in order to feel secure. It breaks the dependency on being admired in order to feel valuable. It breaks the dependency on being in charge in order to feel masculine. It breaks the dependency on controlling perception in order to feel safe. It breaks the dependency on forcing outcomes in order to feel powerful. And when those false dependencies begin to fall away, something remarkable happens. A man starts becoming internally governed. That is true authority. He no longer needs the world to constantly confirm his identity. He no longer needs every relationship to move according to his preference. He no longer needs immediate answers to stay rooted. He no longer needs to dominate tension in order to tolerate it. He no longer needs to perform strength because he has begun to inhabit it. This shift is subtle but irreversible. Before surrender, a man's power is often conditional. He feels strong when things are going well. He feels confident when he is winning. He feels stable when he is desired, respected, productive, or in control. But when uncertainty enters, when love becomes complicated, when silence stretches, when outcomes slip, when identity is challenged, he begins to wobble. Why? Because his center was outsourced. Outsourced to success. Outsourced to validation. Outsourced to image. Outsourced to motion. Outsourced to the illusion that if he could just manage life well enough, he would finally feel safe within himself. But surrender reclaims the center. A man stops asking the world to hold together what only truth can hold together inside him. That is where authority is born, not in domination of the external, in regulation of the internal. The world teaches men to command rooms. Awakening teaches a man to command himself. The world teaches men to influence appearances. Awakening teaches a man to align essence. The world teaches men to win arguments. Awakening teaches a man to become someone whose life carries the argument without needing to shout. That is a different level of power. It is the power of coherence. And coherence is magnetic. Why? Because people can feel when a man is no longer fragmented. They can feel when his words are not compensating for an inner split. They can feel when his calm is real instead of managed. They can feel when his silence is rooted instead of defensive. They can feel when his leadership comes from grounded clarity rather than panic in polished clothing. This is why surrendered authority often appears quieter than egoic power. It does not need theatrics. It does not need constant display. It does not need aggressive proof. It has gravity. And gravity comes from inner alignment. Think about the difference between a man who tries to control every conversation and a man who speaks only when there is something true to say. Think about the difference between a man who needs to be obeyed and a man whose presence naturally invites trust. Think about the difference between a man who leads from fear of being exposed and a man who leads from intimacy with reality. One may appear powerful for a moment. The other becomes unforgettable. Because authority is not the ability to overpower. It is the capacity to remain deeply connected to truth under pressure. That is why surrender is required. Only surrender can strip away the identities that mimic authority without embodying it. The achiever mask. The rescuer mask. The detached masculine mask. The hyperrational mask. The unshakable mask. The spiritually superior mask. The successful but inwardly hollow mask. All of these can create the appearance of authority. But life tests them. And when life tests them, they often crack because they were built on defense, not on depth. Surrender changes the architecture. A man begins rebuilding from a deeper foundation, not from how he wants to be seen, from what is actually true. This changes the way he moves. He becomes less reactive because he is less threatened by discomfort. He becomes less controlling because he is less dependent on certainty. He becomes less manipulative because he is less desperate to manage outcomes. He becomes less performative because he is less hungry for external permission to exist as himself. He becomes more direct, more peaceful, more discerning, more responsible, more grounded in a way that cannot be purchased through image. This is why surrender is not passive. It is the fiercest reorganization of masculine power. It does not remove leadership. It purifies it. It does not remove strength. It deepens it. It does not remove ambition. It sanctifies it. It does not remove desire. It clarifies it. It does not remove fire. It teaches the fire how not to burn the man from within. That is authority. Authority is fire under governance. Not suppressed. Not chaotic. Governed. And a man cannot govern what he has not surrendered to truth about. He cannot govern his anger if he still calls it strength every time it protects his ego. He cannot govern his desire if he still uses it to medicate emptiness. He cannot govern his ambition if it is secretly fueled by shame. He cannot govern his silence if it is really avoidance. He cannot govern his leadership if it is built on fear of losing relevance. This is why surrender is the doorway. It is the moment he stops lying about what drives him. That honesty is what begins cleansing power at its root. A surrendered man can finally ask, what is motivating me here? What am I trying to control? What am I afraid will happen if I tell the truth? What image am I protecting? What part of me still believes authority means never being vulnerable? What am I forcing that would unfold more cleanly if I became more aligned? These questions are not signs of weakness. They are signs that authority is maturing. Because immature authority seeks domination. Mature authority seeks alignment first. And once alignment is established, action becomes cleaner. Speech becomes more precise. Boundaries become less reactive. Love becomes less desperate. Leadership becomes less egoic. Vision becomes less contaminated by unhealed hunger. The man begins operating from inner government rather than emotional weather. That is rare. Most people are governed by mood, fear, ego, validation, and unconscious patterning. They are pulled by every shift in external circumstance. They may appear composed, but internally they are unstable because they have not surrendered the hidden structures that keep them dependent on control. But the surrendered man is different. He still feels. He still grieves. He still experiences uncertainty, longing, and challenge. But he is no longer constantly hijacked by these states. He can hold them without becoming them. That is authority. He can feel anger without needing to weaponize it. He can feel desire without losing discernment. He can feel pain without collapsing into self-pity. He can feel love without abandoning boundaries. He can face loss without losing his dignity. He can hear truth without needing to defend an image. This kind of man does not become less human through surrender. He becomes more trustworthy in his humanity. And trust is one of the highest expressions of authority. Not trust forced by intimidation. Trust evoked by coherence. People trust a man whose nervous system is not always reaching for control. People trust a man who can admit what is true. People trust a man who does not turn every challenge into a theater of ego. People trust a man whose presence feels anchored in something deeper than self-importance. This is why surrendered authority is often spiritually palpable. It carries peace. Not because the man never faces battle, but because the battle is no longer primarily against reality itself. He is no longer at war with what is. He may confront, protect, build, challenge, lead, and decide with great force when needed. But the force is clean because it is not born from panic. It is born from clarity. This is what many men have never seen modeled. They have seen domination. They have seen charisma. They have seen aggression. They have seen discipline without tenderness. They have seen control mistaken for leadership. They have seen emotional detachment mistaken for maturity. They have seen power without peace. So when surrender begins teaching them another way, it feels almost unbelievable. How can letting go create more authority? How can truth create more power than image? How can stillness create more impact than constant assertion? How can humility make a man stronger? How can release become command? Because what is surrendered is not the core self. It is the false self that keeps blocking access to the core. When illusion drops, essence stands up. That is the mystery. A man does not become authoritative by adding more armor. He becomes authoritative when there is less interference between his soul and his expression. Less fear. Less posturing. Less compensation. Less image management. Less internal contradiction. What remains is clean masculine signal. And that signal changes everything. He walks differently because he is no longer carrying so many masks. He speaks differently because his words no longer need to defend a false identity. He chooses differently because he is less seduced by what flatters the ego and more devoted to what honors truth. He loves differently because he is no longer asking intimacy to stabilize what only surrender could stabilize within him. This is why the surrendered masculine becomes more magnetic, not less. Not because he tries to attract, but because the absence of internal scrambling creates presence. And presence is magnetic. The world is filled with men trying to become impressive. Far fewer are becoming inwardly ordered. But inward order is what gives rise to real authority. Without it, leadership collapses under stress. Love becomes distortion. Purpose becomes compensation. Success becomes addiction. Masculinity becomes theater. With it, something sacred emerges. A man who can lead without controlling. Protect without dominating. Provide without deriving his whole identity from utility. Desire without becoming possessed by it. Speak with conviction without losing humility. Stand in power without disconnecting from tenderness. That man has crossed a threshold. Not perfection. Authority. And authority is what happens when surrender has done its work. So if you are afraid that surrender will weaken you, hear this clearly. What surrender destroys is not your strength. It is your dependence on false strength. What surrender removes is not your power. It is your addiction to power that was never truly yours because it depended on constant management. What surrender gives is something far greater. A throne within. An inner seat of order. A place from which you can respond instead of react. A place from which you can lead instead of perform. A place from which you can love instead of grasp. A place from which your masculinity no longer needs to shout because it has become anchored. That is the shocking truth. The man becomes most powerful not when he finally controls the world around him, but when he becomes so aligned within himself that control is no longer the source of his authority. Then he does not merely look like a man in power. He becomes a man whose power has been made clean by truth. Chapter 10. Let the old self die. There comes a moment in every true awakening when a man can no longer stand at the threshold. He must choose. Not between comfort and pain. Not between success and failure. Not even between love and loneliness. He must choose between the man he has been and the man his soul is asking him to become. This is the final confrontation. because by the time a man reaches this point, he has already seen too much to return to sleep. He has seen the cost of control. He has seen the emptiness of performance. He has seen how the false masculine survives through image, fear, detachment, and endless striving. He has seen how surrender strips away illusion. He has seen how collapse reveals truth. He has seen how silence reforms him. He has seen how love can mirror his wounds. He has seen how real authority is born not from domination, but from inner order. So now, only one question remains. Will he let the old self die? This is where many hesitate. Because even when a man knows the old identity is false, he may still feel attached to it. Not because it brought him peace, but because it brought him familiarity. It gave him a role, a pattern, a face to wear in the world. It helped him survive long before he knew there was another way. And survival identities do not disappear easily. They whisper to him in the final hour. Stay the same. Grip harder. Do not change too much. Do not become too open. Do not release the armor. Do not trust this new path. Go back to what you know. Go back to proving. Go back to controlling. Go back to being the man who never has to feel this deeply. But something deeper inside him now knows that going back is no longer possible. Because awakening is cruel to illusion. Once truth has entered a man deeply enough, he cannot fully enjoy the old mask again. He may try to wear it, but it will feel tight. He may try to return to old patterns, but they will taste bitter. He may try to perform the old strength, but he will feel the fracture immediately. This is grace, even when it hurts. Because the soul is now asking for full permission. Not partial change. Not spiritual language without embodiment. Not insight without surrender. Not longing without transformation. Full permission. Permission for the old self to fall. Permission for the false armor to crack. Permission for the identity built on fear to lose its throne. Permission for the version of masculinity that depended on control to finally bow before truth. This is not destruction for the sake of destruction. This is sacred death. And sacred death is what makes sacred life possible. Every real man must eventually discover this. There are parts of him that cannot be refined. They must be released. There are identities that cannot be healed into wholeness because they were never built on truth. They were built on compensation, protection, and unconscious fear. The achiever who only feels worthy when admired. The protector who secretly uses strength to avoid tenderness. The detached man who calls his distance wisdom. The disciplined man whose structure hides his exhaustion. The silent man who has mistaken emotional exile for maturity. The spiritual man who talks about awakening but still worships control. These versions cannot follow him into the deeper life. They must die. And yes, death is painful even when it is necessary. Because something in him will grieve. He will grieve the certainty he used to have. He will grieve the image he once protected. He will grieve the relationships built around who he used to be. He will grieve the old dreams that no longer fit. He will grieve the years spent asleep. He will grieve the boy inside him who learned to survive through armor and now must learn another way to live. That grief is not weakness. It is evidence of transition. A snake does not shed old skin without friction. A seed does not become a tree without breaking. A man does not become spiritually embodied without losing identities that once felt essential. So if grief appears, let it appear. If tears rise, let them rise. If silence deepens, let it deepen. If confusion comes, let it humble you without making you retreat. Because this is not the end of your becoming. This is the end of your impersonation. And what rises after that is quieter, but infinitely more real. The new man does not need to announce himself. He does not need to prove he has changed. He does not need to dominate, chase, posture, or perform his awakening. He simply begins to live differently. He moves with less desperation. He speaks with more truth. He loves with more responsibility. He chooses with more discernment. He rests with less guilt. He leads with more peace. He carries pain without making it his identity. He carries power without making it his God. He has become inhabitable. And that may be one of the deepest signs of masculine rebirth. He is no longer a battlefield inside himself. He is no longer divided between image and essence. He is no longer building a life to avoid his soul. He is no longer asking the world to validate what only truth can establish within him. He becomes the kind of man who can sit alone without abandoning himself. The kind of man who can love without needing to possess. The kind of man who can lead without needing to control. The kind of man who can feel deeply without losing direction. The kind of man who can surrender without feeling weak. The kind of man who has discovered that death of ego is not collapse of masculinity, but its purification. This is the final invitation. Not to become perfect. Not to become superior. Not to become some unreachable image of spiritual masculinity. But to become real. Real enough to stop lying. Real enough to release what no longer aligns. Real enough to let love refine you instead of merely excite you. Real enough to let pain instruct you instead of harden you. Real enough to let surrender become devotion, not defeat. Real enough to stop asking, how do I look powerful? And start asking, how do I live true? That is the deeper masculine path. And if you are here now, if something in your life is crumbling, if your old confidence is failing, if your illusions are breaking, if your hunger for something deeper can no longer be numbed, then hear this with your whole being. You are not being erased. You are being revealed. You are not losing your masculinity. You are losing what distorted it. You are not being punished because life has become uncomfortable. You are being invited into a form of strength that comfort could never teach you. Let the old self die. Let the false protector die. Let the desperate achiever die. Let the image-dependent man die. Let the emotionally exiled man die. Let the version of you that only knew how to survive die with gratitude, because he got you here. But do not let him lead you any further. There is another man waiting underneath. A man with clearer eyes. A man with a steadier breath. A man with cleaner motives. A man with a braver heart. A man who no longer mistakes control for strength. A man who no longer mistakes silence for emptiness. A man who no longer mistakes surrender for defeat. A man who can stand before life, before love, before truth and say, I am ready to stop pretending. I am ready to stop running. I am ready to become. And that is where awakening becomes destiny. So to every man listening who feels broken, confused, humbled, stripped, or undone, do not despise this season. Honor it. Because some of the holiest seasons do not feel glorious when you are inside them. They feel like endings. They feel like failure. They feel like being emptied. But heaven often works through holy subtraction before sacred construction. So trust the fire. Trust the silence. Trust the collapse. Trust the mirror. Trust the surrender. Trust what is being born in you, even if it does not yet have a name. And when you rise from this chapter, rise differently. Not louder. Not harder. Not more defended. Rise true. Rise grounded. Rise clean. Rise with a masculinity that no longer feeds on fear. Rise with a heart that has survived its own dismantling. Rise with the kind of authority that comes only to the man who has let illusion die. Rise with reverence for the path that broke you open and gave you back to yourself. Because the greatest shock was never that surrender would cost you something. The greatest shock is that surrender gave you back your soul. If this message found you at the right time, write in the comments, I choose the real man. And if you are walking this path of surrender, masculine healing, and spiritual awakening. Subscribe to this channel and join me for the next chapter. Because this is not the end. This is where your real life begins.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.